women's health is such a dense topic. I'm going to tread very carefully to try and plant some quick big picture seeds. Know that not all of it might make sense if you're new to TCM, but I will give some clarity at the end around some takeaways as a student, and for teachers who want to work more therapeutically. Obviously, we've got lots of details in our female health course. So hello, I see someone from Seattle, New York, London, Jakarta, DC, a few from Canada, Phoenix, Switzerland, Arkansas, Maryland, so many, Germany, Puerto Rico. And hopefully I'm going to make it over to London. I see a few of you from London. I still have it on my calendar for August. So I try yoga. So, and I think it's going to be a TCM training, but we're still playing it by ear a little. I'm Tiffany Cruikshank. I've been teaching yoga for about 26 years. My specialty has mostly, with my patients, I've also seen patients for about 19 days. No, wow, I really need to slow down. 19 years, 19 days. I've been seeing patients for about 19 years, and my specialty has always been sports medicine and orthopedics. I was the only acupuncturist at the Nike headquarters for a long time, and I saw all of their employees and athletes that came through, which was I think it was 8,000 employees at the time. And I had this influx of patients who were seeking help with fertility, and then some of them with more just female health issues. And so I ended up taking on a secondary specialty in women's health. We've now changed the term to female health to be more inclusive. So you'll see that name change if you're familiar with our trainings. It's the same course, it's the same training. But I took on a secondary specialty when I was at Nike because I had so many patients coming in looking for help with fertility. And I loved working with my fertility patients and helping hundreds of people. I had a wall of photos of the babies that I helped with, which was really fun. But I really enjoyed working with women and or females of any sort to help get pregnant or optimize their hormones and their cycle. I've worked with patients with PCOS and endometriosis, infertility issues, premenstrual issues, painful periods, menopause, all sorts of different things. So what I love about using TCM to understand the female reproductive cycle is that it really brilliantly makes sense of what Western medicine knows so little about. Things like PCOS and endometriosis and infertility, which we're learning a lot more on very quickly about infertility, but there's still a lot we don't know. So it gives some really impactful resources. And, if you do end up taking the training, there's so many details of different ways to work with PCOS and endometriosis, which isn't the same for everyone. We know that everyone is so different. And the importance, I think, is really understanding the person that you're working with and being able to modify and adapt to that person. And that's what we really love doing at Yoga Medicine, is teaching you the what, why, and how behind it so that you can individualize and support the person you're working with. Now, in this presentation, I'm really going to focus on the students. And I think as a teacher, if you're interested in using this with your students, the first is to be a student, which if you're a male wanting to do this, it might be a little challenging, but you could use it maybe with a female in your household or something. But the first, I think, is really practicing this on ourselves. So this presentation is really aimed at students and practices, and I'm just going to give you a really quick, brief overview of some of the important insights. I'm going to talk about my 5 top tips to support female reproductive health with yoga. But I'm also, and I'll summarize that at the end, but what I want to do is really take you through a quick overview of the 4 phases of the cycle, talk about some myths, some common myths in the yoga world, and some things to pay attention to as we go through each phase. And then it'll probably be a brief Q&A because there's really so much we could talk about. And I think it's going to open up a lot of questions, which is kind of beyond this short context. But what I want to give you is some clarity on some things you can use going forward. So some tools to restore hormonal balance and physiological health in the system, and give some general ideas. Obviously, there's a lot more specifics to individualize this depending on specific issues or people or contexts. So there's so much, I can't overemphasize that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And that's the beauty of TCM is, and when I say TCM, that's traditional Chinese medicine, is that it really gives us so many details to work with for each person. So I'm not going to go into all the details, and I'm not going to be able to explain all of TCM, but in the course, we give you everything you need to understand it all. I'm not going to be able to give you all of the what, why, and how behind it, but what I want to do is give you a big picture overview for students and teachers so that you can start to use it right away. Okay, so that's my disclaimer. I always like to summarize things and be succinct, but remember, there's a lot more to this. So let's talk about the first phase. So we're going to divide, and different people divide the cycle into different phases. Some people just divide it into follicular and luteal. Some people will leave out ovulation, which we'll look at the end. But when we're supporting changes in this cycle, we want to look at all 4 phases. And the first one is going to start with the period. Now, before we get into this, I just want to briefly plant a little seed for what yin and yang are. And I think a lot of people are familiar with these, but just a reminder that yang represents this idea of warmth or activity or movement or function, this more active, going, doing, the sympathetic nervous system. And we can also put progesterone as a more yang substance. In Chinese medicine, yin is the opposite. It represents the opposite of all of those, basically, the more cooling aspects of the practice, more calming, more nourishing. It's what creates the substance and nourishment to be able to move. The yang is what moves the yin. It's also representative of our ability to be introspective and listen, and that parasympathetic mode. This idea of being versus doing, which is more of the yang, and we would put estrogen in this. And just in a very brief summary, in Chinese medicine, this idea of balance between yin and yang is representative of this harmonious balance within the body and within our kind of big picture awareness of health. Now, everything can be further broken down. That's a very simplistic understanding of it. But this idea of balance between yin and yang in Chinese medicine is very important. And it's very important when we look at the cycle as well. So when we talk about this first phase, I think one of the key points to take away here is that what we're really trying to do in this phase is clear out the lining of the endometrium. We're shedding that lining. And a lot of times in yoga, I think my interpretation is many of the reasons behind our avoidance of practices during this phase is actually more of a cultural issue. In India, women weren't allowed in the temples during menses, and traditional yoga was practiced more in the temples. And so there is a cultural practice around this. And when we look at this kind of physiological understanding of what's happening along with the TCM understanding, we can kind of see that there is actually a really important place for circulation here. And I'll get to what that looks like in a moment. But the main purpose of this phase of the cycle is that we really want to shed the entire endometrium, that lining of the endometrium, in order to prepare. This allows us to kind of like clear the slate to prepare to be able to rebuild a more smooth, orderly, layered endometrium for implantation later. So it kind of sets the stage for what's to come. Really important. So when we look at this, we're looking at the ovarian cycle on the top and the hormone levels on the bottom here, and you can kind of see the decoder at the bottom. But what we're seeing around the period is this drop in estrogen and progesterone, which is what signals the body to shed that lining. And optimally, the periods are about 4 to 5 days. That could also be 3 to 6 days. But what we're looking at is this time between when the period starts and the very end of even if there's any spotting, the end of the period or the end of any spotting. So that full time. And what's happening within the body is that the blood vessels within that endometrium and the lining there are actually constricting, and then there's less blood flow as a result. And what happens is the tissues start to die off there. then the blood vessels kind of come back again, they pop up again, and it pushes the endometrial layers out. And so the circulation that's happening within the endometrium, within the pelvis, for us really, is really important, because that circulation is what's kind of driving that shedding of the endometrial lining there. So I think it's helpful just to think about really flushing out the uterus. Now, there's obviously some exceptions to this, even for, for women who have really, females who have really heavy periods. We might need to individualize this a little bit, but even for heavy periods, we do want to shed the entire lining. We do want to get it out because we want to, again, clear that slate. Imagine, well, the analogy of like having a whiteboard and not cleaning it all the way before I start writing on it again. I really want to be able to clear that slate to be able to have a really healthy and clear out the hormone receptors too, to be able to prepare for a healthy cycle. So back to this one here, this first phase is really about just that. It's about clearing the slate. I want to be able to empty in order to fill. What's really interesting in this period of the cycle too, one, we want to support circulation in the pelvis, and I'll talk to that in a moment, but it's also a great time to detoxify, which is funny because a lot of times we end up eating sweet things or indulgent foods, but this is a great time to support that shedding process by detoxifying, whether that's whatever way you like to do it. I know there's a lot of different ways to do that. But that helps to clear out those hormone receptor sites on the cells that will help support the remainder of the cycle. So it's also a great time to detoxify if you're trying to get pregnant, because there's no pregnancy. It's a safe time to detox during the period, and a great way to support the rest of the cycle. So the trick here is that every female has different preferences toward movement during this time. And some women really like to exercise and do exercise. And so that moving qi and blood that I'm talking about, that enhancing circulation, when I say move qi and blood, that's enhancing circulation really in the pelvis, can happen. I mean, that could be really from any exercise. Of course, we can, drive circulation throughout the whole body and just, go for a run or do something simple like that. But it could also be very specific to the pelvis. So simple things like pelvic tilts, supine, maybe even for people who don't like movement during their period. I can lie on my back and do little cat cows with the pelvis there to create some circulation. Or for people who enjoy it, doing some MFR on the abdomen, or even around the hips too, anywhere around the pelvis can be a great way to enhance circulation. So it doesn't have to mean vigorous activity, because really, remember, our effort is to enhance circulation around the pelvis. So I can do this in a way that is appreciated by the individual I'm working with. So some females, like I said, really like to be active, and they've found that to be helpful. Great. We can support that with active practices too, also supporting this downward movement of energy through things like malasana and squats. Or for females who don't enjoy movement, where it's so hard to get going and they're just in so much discomfort, I want to find ways to create some circulation locally, whether that's through abdominal massage or MFR or pelvic tilts, cat and cows, simple movements. And I'll show you some other options at the end of this video too. But I want to meet them where they're at. So finding some local circulation, increasing that circulation to the pelvis and that downward flow. This is really important, especially in Chinese medicine. Stagnation issues show up here, and that would be things like dysmenorrhea or painful periods, irritability, bloating, frustration, agitation can all show up here. And those are what we call stagnation issues, which need, again, more of that circulation to help support them. So even if there's not stagnation, even if there's not symptoms of stagnation, as I mentioned, I still want to create circulation here to help encourage that shedding of the lining. So that's the first phase. Find a way to create circulation. If you don't like exercise on your period, find another way to do it. So the next one is the follicular phase. And this one is named because this is where the follicles are doing most of their growth and development. This is also where the lining of the endometrium is happening, or the lining of the endometrium is starting to grow back. So this is really thought of as a growth phase. And it's important just to think about it as that. We can talk about a lot more of the details in the training. There's plenty more to learn, but just think of this one as a growth phase. So the first phase is that shedding phase. This is the growth phase where the lining of the endometrium is starting to grow, the follicles are growing. And so what we want to focus on in this one is nourishing that yin, that substance. And in Chinese medicine, the yin is what creates the substance for growth. Remember, we talked about the yang being more of the function and activity, and yin actually being more of the substance and the nourishment. So this is an important phase, again, to prepare for what's to come. But for this one, I really want to focus on nourishing. And this is, again, after the last day of the period, or the last day of spotting. And for our purposes, I'm going to give you a couple different options, but for women who are trying to get pregnant, we'll do this one right up until a couple of days before ovulation. I'll get to that in a moment. So most of the development of the endometrium is happening here as estrogen is priming the endometrium, starting to come up here in this follicular phase. So again, here's the menses, and then we've got the follicular phase as the estrogen rises and the endometrium, endometrial development starts to happen here. And so in Chinese medicine, we really need this to support yin and blood is a form of yin to support that growth. So again, once the period is completely over, I want to continue this until a couple of days before ovulation. So usually until day 11, if someone's in a 28-day cycle, you'll need to kind of shift that a little bit if you have longer or shorter cycles, but that's an approximate. If you're not trying to conceive, if you're not trying to get pregnant, I usually just recommend that women focus on this phase for about a week after their period's over. And for this one, it's really easy. What we're focusing on in this phase, and you can see that follicle growing and growing in order to release the egg at ovulation. But in this phase, we really want to focus on these nourishing practices. So anything restorative in nature, whether you like yin yoga or whether you prefer restorative yoga or meditation. And as always, we'll see this at the end. Again, I'll give a quick overview at the end, but we always want to support that local circulation in the pelvis really throughout the cycle to help support all of the different phases. So you'll still do that here. And it's not that you can't do active yoga practices or do your normal exercise, but really just that you want to add some form of nourishment in here, whether that's one restorative pose at night or before bed or at the end of your day, or maybe a 30-minute practice, or maybe a 60-minute practice every other day, or whatever you have time for. But I have some of that nourishment. Maybe that's even just taking this week to remind yourself to slow down and check in, allowing yourself to have a little slower pace. That doesn't mean you can't still get your work done, but even just more of a reflective week potentially. So yin can be great. There's a lot of different options there. And also foods that will nourish blood. So iron-rich foods, whether that's beets, spinach, eggs, or nuts, or if you eat meat, red meat is an easy one. So having a little bit of local circulation, again, I'll talk about a few of those at the end, but really focusing on more restorative practices here. So we've got moving and really focusing on circulation and downward flow. Then we've got nourishment to help support this growth phase, which is so important. So the next one, oops, there we are. The next one is going to be ovulation. And again, if you're not trying to get pregnant, this one can be kind of tedious, especially if you don't know exactly where you're ovulating in your cycle. So for females who aren't trying to get pregnant, I will just leave this part out. Again, I'll show that graphic at the end. But this is where the egg is released from the follicle. It's a quick event. However, we're stretching it over several days to help spark that turnover. This is where the yin phase of the cycle turns into the yang phase of the cycle. And it's that there's a lot of different things quickly happening here. When we look at the changes in the hormones, you can see everything's happening right around the center point around ovulation, as well as that egg being released. And so it's a quick changeover period. And what we're really trying to do is spark that yang, that shift from nourishment and yin and growth to release to movement that's happening here. And in Chinese medicine, the yang is what drives that turnover process. So generally speaking, we're usually using this with women who are trying to get pregnant, with females who are trying to get pregnant. I'm usually using this between day 12 to 16. That's if they have a 28-day cycle. We're talking a lot of detail about how to shift that depending on where they're at. But you can imagine if you're not on a 28-day cycle, you could do it 2 days before your expected ovulation, start a couple days before your expected ovulation, your first positive, if you know where that is. And then go for a couple days after, or you could, if you're doing basal body temperature, you could start 4 days prior to your expected temperature spike. If all of that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. You can do it somewhere around that time and just shift it a little forward or back if you have a longer or shorter cycle than 28 days. But for this one, we're doing a little bit more vigorous movements to spark that yang. We've got the luteinizing hormone that's then spiking there to trigger that dominant follicle to open and release the egg and eventually travel down the tube. So the estrogen spike is what's triggering that LH spike. So there's a lot going on, which is then lifting the temperature. So after that, we've got a higher temperature, if you're familiar with the basal body charts. So again, in this third phase, what we're really trying to do, even though ovulation is happening in a short period of time, we're trying to support this turnover from yin to yang by sparking some warmth and heat here. So what we're really using is we're still increasing circulation to the pelvis, but we're using quicker movements, more vigorous movements. I have some examples I'll show you at the end on our site. If you're thinking about non-yoga stuff, this could also be like a quick sprint or HIIT training, or something to kind of spark up some quick movement and warmth in the system. You know, in yoga, we have some maybe Kapalabhati movements, some movements with Kapalabhati that can spark some of that warmth and quicker movement in the body there. It doesn't necessarily need to be vigorous. I still need to cater this to the person I'm working with and their movement capacity. There's a lot of ways to do that that are really accessible. So we're switching from the nourishing phase to this movement phase where we're trying to spark that release of the egg and then the movement down the tube. So quicker, more vigorous, more active, but doesn't necessarily need to be depleting. All right, so many things to talk about, but I'm really trying to stay big picture here with you, so it makes more sense. So let's talk about the fourth one, and then we'll put them all together. The fourth one is the luteal phase. And for this one, we want to really focus on creating a welcoming environment. This is where the egg is traveling down the tube and eventually moving for implantation within that lining. And so for most of us, this will be actually the most balanced practice. We want to create a warm, welcoming environment. We want to support a little bit of nourishment and circulation and calming. And so you can think of this one as maybe the most balanced practice. If you were to maybe take your regular practice and just slightly modify it a little bit to create more downward movement and more nourishing practices, and then more vigorous movement here, and then more of a balanced practice in this fourth phase, this would be the most balanced of the practices there. So now the egg has been released. We've got the corpus luteum, which is the remnants of the follicle, which are releasing progesterone. Remember, progesterone is more of that yang hormone in the body and is what is increasing the body temperature and softening the endometrium to create a nice, warm, welcome, little cozy nest for implantation. So again, we'll want to boost yang. What's interesting about Chinese medicine, though, is when we look at like the yin yang symbol, the implication there is that they're moving and creating each other. So in order to support yang, we also need to support yin to some extent. So we'll do a little bit of both here. That's why I said this one is really the most balanced. We still want to create that circulation in the pelvis. And if I'm trying to conceive, I'll also support more upward movement. So legs up the wall, maybe with a little prop under the pelvis to create it in a very simple way, versus if I'm not trying to conceive, I'll do more movement and maybe a little bit of downward, maybe some squats and malasana again as a way to prepare for the period that week before. So this is the longest one. And this one actually kind of depends more on your purpose here. If you're trying to conceive, again, I'm going to want a little bit more balanced practice. Some calming practices are always good, especially when working with women trying to conceive or females trying to conceive. But for females who are working with painful periods or PMS or other issues and not trying to conceive, I do, especially this 1 week before the period, really want to focus on having more active practices to create movement of qi and blood. As I mentioned before, these are often symptoms of stagnation. And so getting that circulation going will also support the warmth and the yang. And I won't need to worry as much about the calming practices, though I think that's good for everyone and can also be very supportive for the hormones all cycle long. So we want to, again, promote that warmth and yang. We want to move qi and blood. For females trying to conceive, we want some calming practices. Actually, I think that's really good for everyone. So again, I might have maybe one yin or restorative pose, and then some circulatory practices, which might be whole body circulation. It might be very local. I love to add for people I'm working with who are really trying to work on specific issues. I love trying to add some circulation locally. I'll show you those in just a second with some compression or circulation right around the pelvis. So nourish, move / warm, and calm. And then I'm either going to lift if they're trying to get pregnant with some restorative inversions, or maybe descend if they're not trying to get pregnant, as a way to help support that transition into the next phase, which is the period, which is that shedding of the lining. And as I mentioned, for females who are not trying to get pregnant, the second week of this luteal phase, the week right before the period, is really important to move qi and blood or create circulation through the pelvis. So I like to kind of make those practices a little bit more vigorous in particular. Again, it doesn't need to be depleting. Find what works for the person, but I'm trying to find a way to get a lot of circulation happening as a preparation for that shedding of the lining. So let's talk about some ways to create that circulation, because I have some favorite ways that I like to use, and I'll show you those really quickly here. And then hopefully it'll spark some ideas in your head of other ways to do this as well. But some of my favorite ways to create circulation locally through the pelvis are using a roll. So using this kind of compression technique as we compress, pressing some of the blood flow out of the tissues, and as we release, drawing that blood flow in, kind of similar to hydrotherapy too, what we might use cold application of cold to shunt the blood out of the tissues, and then the warmth is what brings it back into the tissues. But these compression techniques can be a really great one in any of those phases where we're trying to draw more circulation through the pelvis, which really you could do this all month long. It's one of the reasons why acupuncture is used so much in fertility clinics. As an acupuncturist, in the acupuncture world, we know there's a lot more to it, but just enhancing circulation through the pelvis can be very beneficial for women trying to conceive, for females trying to conceive. So this is another way to do it. And it was always my mission as a healthcare provider, not to make people dependent on me, which is really how I started using yoga with my patients a lot, was to be able to give them tools so that they could do the work on their own too. So this is why I love this one. Of course, it doesn't replace going and seeing an acupuncturist or maybe your yoga teacher, but it gives us something that we can use on our own. So what I'm doing is I'm rolling up this blanket. You could use a large bath towel. And now, depending on what poses you like, you can do this in a lot of different poses. I'll show you a few. Pigeon is one. Now you can still use this prop if you want something under your butt, but I'm wedging this roll up really high into the hip crease and then coming forward. I don't need to go deep. Everyone has a different capacity in all of these poses, and that's fine. But what I'm trying to do is create some healthy compression here, not the negative compression we tend to think about in yoga, where we're trying to avoid that pinching pain, but a nice healthy compression to help shift the blood flow in the area. Now, when I'm doing these compressive techniques, I want to stay for at least a minute or two. And then I want to come out, and I can even just come into any position that allows that blood flow to come back into the tissues. So sometimes I'll do like Ardha Matsyendrasana. You could hook the foot over the knee or not. Again, my main purpose is really creating that compression, being able to sit up tall and create some compression and stay for a minute or two. And then you could lie on your back, or then you could come into maybe low lunge with that same side back to create a little more opening. Or I also like just taking that same roll. And again, this was the side that I was compressing. So I'm now opening this side to, again, get the blood shifting in and out of the tissues to help support that circulation. So I swear I have my do not disturb on. I'm not sure why I'm still getting sounds. So those are some of the techniques that I really like to get that circulation flowing through, in and out. Of course, just some general things. I talked about, the cat and cow movements here, which you can also do obviously in tabletop. You can also do them in low lunge, maybe stepping outside the hand. You can also do it in crescent lunge with your hands on the thigh. So just getting that pelvic movement happening. You don't need to see the details on that. Pelvic circles, we can do these seated here. And then we can do circles. We can do it seated here. I like to have my hands clasped behind my head, just to just to get a little bit more movement there, and then maybe isolating it more in the pelvis. And so again, rather than just doing it once or twice, probably want to do it for a minute or two there to really have a good impact on those tissues, creating more movement there and circulation as a result. Of course, just a full body movement, sun salutes of some sort, can be a great way to move circulation throughout the whole body, but I really like to make it focused locally there. All right. So of course, with all of these, I really want to keep in mind the normal activity level of the person you're working with or yourself. And I don't need to go too far out of that context, but when I'm looking at these phases of the cycle, just finding little shifts, or maybe giving yourself permission to have a slightly different practice throughout the different phases of the cycle. So, during my period, again, I'm just finding ways to move chi and blood. If you love myofascial release in the abdomen, I know most females I work with either love it or they hate it, that massage in their abdomen during their period. And you don't need to work against that. If you hate it, there's plenty of other things you can do. You can use some of the ones we use. You can maybe use your fingers to do some abdominal massage gently. You might do some Kapalabhati breath. I know that one's actually traditionally contraindicated in yoga. But I actually find this to be a very helpful practice to move chi and blood in the pelvis, especially for women with stagnation issues, painful periods, PMS, irritability. And rather than clenching and engaging, I like to think of the belly just kind of flopping back and forth. So it's like a lazy Kapalabhati. So there are plenty of ways to find that, but in this first phase, just finding a way to create circulation. Maybe you just want to go for a walk. Maybe you tend to be sedentary during your period and you just make the choice to go for a walk each day. There are a lot of ways to get chi and blood moving. So it doesn't necessarily have to be yoga. Hopefully this will inspire you to think in a lot of different ways, but to find things that you can incorporate into your routines. And then that week after the period, being able to find some introspective nourishment, have some restorative practices of some sort. Maybe that's just a short meditation each day, whatever you like. Maybe it's one pose. And then if you're trying to conceive, looking at some kind of quick, vigorous movements there, maybe that's Kapalabhati movements. Maybe that's Kapalabhati with some cat-cow, some of the seated stuff. There's so many variations on these. Or if you're a student, if you're not a teacher, maybe that's just some more vigorous movement in general. I'll show you some options on our site in a moment. Maybe that's more vigorous exercise. Maybe that's more vigorous yoga practices. Maybe that's adding in some Kapalabhati or some Nali, if you're familiar with those. And then more of a balance practice here, depending on what you're working on. Now, here's the other one I said I mentioned I would show at the end. If you're not trying to conceive, this is a little easier way to think about it. So just split the line right down in half. So whatever the length of your cycle is, this is a 28-day cycle, just split it in half. If it's 30, you'd split it in half there at 15. But I have the period phase, which is clear to mark. And then the follicular phase will be everything up until that halfway point. And then I'll shift to more movement-based practices there to create some circulation. And then if you're someone who has painful periods or PMS, especially that week before, really trying to kick up the pace a little bit to create more circulation. And again, that could be with local techniques, the compression techniques I mentioned, or myofascial release is a great local circulation support there. Or that could be through more movement or exercise, whatever you like. So you don't have to focus too much on ovulation. You can just take that out. That can be a tedious part sometimes. So here's those 5 tips. And this is kind of what we talked about already. But one is that myth around movement and the menses. And again, it doesn't have to be vigorous, but just finding a way to create some circulation during the period. This is so important. I mentioned it as this clearing the slate. I mentioned, trying to write on a whiteboard when it hasn't been fully erased. This really sets the stage for the rest of the hormonal shifts in the cycle. So it's such an important one to find some way to create circulation during the menses, whatever that means. Maybe that's jumping on a trampoline. Maybe that's going for a run. Maybe that's, doing some of the compression techniques I just showed you, or some myofascial release in the belly. Maybe that's just your normal vinyasa practice. Maybe that's just a flow practice and keeping some awareness in the pelvis there. And then the second is having some restoration of whatever form. I said restore purposefully to not limit it to restorative yoga, but anything restorative, yin, introspective, yoga nidra, some of the calming pranayamas and meditation. Then to shift that at ovulation, if you're trying to get pregnant, to spark that young with some more vigorous, quicker movements, but not depleting. And then a more balanced practice, active practices, especially for those who are having pain or PMS, especially staying active that week before the menses. And then calming and nervous system regulation, I think, can really be helpful throughout. It's such an important one, especially for females under a lot of stress, because it will influence the hormonal cycle. The hormones, stress is such a big factor. And so finding something that you enjoy, again, whether that's meditation or pranayama or yoga nidra, Even acupressure, MFR and acupressure can be really calming if that's what you like. Find what works for you. And that's why I love on Yoga Medicine Online, we have so many different resources to calm and help regulate the nervous system. MFR, acupressure, yoga nidra, pranayama, meditation, but to find that nice stress regulation throughout the cycle. And I mentioned before too, that practices to promote blood flow in the pelvis are good really any time of the cycle, but especially in that period phase and the week before, and at ovulation. And then of course, individualizing and listening. As a teacher, the only way to really individualize it is to do some deeper study and really understand all of the details, which is beyond even a 45-minute presentation. This was me aiming for a half an hour. So to individualize it, you'll definitely need to look at our teacher training, which is 25 hours to get so many details. But if you're a student, I think that individualization is also the listening, noticing the effects after your practice. And usually the effects that we're looking at on this, because we only get one little glimpse at each part of the cycle throughout it, it really takes a few cycles to notice a shift usually. And that would be pretty quick for females who have had issues for years. It will take longer than a few cycles to notice a change. Usually everyone's different, but because I just get one glimpse at each part of the cycle in that whole phase, it takes at least a few to kind of really notice the effect. So try it on for size, notice how it goes, shift as you need to, and find these just the little changes at first. Don't be in a rush to change everything, but just find something simple that you can stick with, because that's going to be key. So here's just a quick overview. I have some tools for you guys who are students in a minute too, but for teachers, this is just some of the topics covered with 4 sections of the training. So first we lay down the Tcm principles. If you've done this with us before, some of it will be a review, but I find it's really helpful to hear it again. And then we go into really the details specific to the female reproductive system, which will be different than those. But we lay the groundwork of everything you need for Tcm to understand what's coming here. And then we talk in detail in section 2 about all the 4 phases we talked about really briefly just now. We talk about them in much more detail. We talk about conducting an intake, all of the important questions to ask, how to interpret basal body temperatures through a Tcm lens. And then the last 2 sections are specific scenarios and dealing with things like supporting PCOS and endometriosis, dysmenorrhea, PMS, and then all these different period changes. Are they coming too early? Are they coming late? Are they irregular? Are they heavy? Are they light? Are they long? Is there bleeding between the periods? Are there no periods? And then we talk more about fertility and menopause, lots of acupressure resources to use, and then case studies and applications, more applications there. So there's the core competencies for the training too. But with each training, I'm not going to read these to you, but there they are. Each training we have, each section we have some therapeutic practices. And what we've done is we've pulled them out. I've pulled them out so you have a practice for each phase. And then you have 2 practices for phase 4 for people trying to conceive or not trying to conceive. So you have the therapeutic asana practices, you have the lectures, you have our office hours Q&A, which are live and also recorded. You've got homework to integrate the information, and all of the videos besides the live office hours. So you've got live office hours to come and ask your questions, but all the videos are pre-recorded, so you can do it at your own time. You can come back to them, which is the biggest perk, I think. Once you finish, you can go back and look at them again. You have them as a resource, and then you have case studies to bring all that information to life. So for teachers, this is the platform. If you haven't done a training with us before, this is what it looks like when you log in. So at Yoga Medicine, there's a login button on the top right of the website, if you haven't noticed that already. And once you log in, it shows everything you're signed up for. I'm signed up for all of them, but I've clicked on the female health training here. And then this first page just shows you all the details, a little welcome, kind of tells you a little bit about the course. It gives you the Zoom link to join the office hours and the dates and times, suggested props. And then at the bottom, you've got a link to the manual, the discussion board. So this is where you can post your questions for the office hours call. If you can't make it, you can post your questions here and then watch the recording, so you don't have to be live, because I know there's all different time zones. So if I go to section 1, we've got some intro videos there. We've got practice videos and a recap of each one. So you kind of can understand the what, why, and how behind the sequencing. And then we've got the lecture videos, and you can see this is section 1. So you've got the details on TCM, the 8 principles pathology, and then how it relates to the reproductive cycle, lifestyle, 5 elements, fertility, and some reviews. And I think you have a review in every section because I think that's so important to really get the information in there. This is the link to the live Q&A calls and then the homeworks, and you can check them off as you go there. And then a live chat. So you can post questions there, connect with the teachers there. Then here's the manual. I'll just give you a little quick view that gives the details. So there's all the details there. But what I wanted to show you here was flurried through a lot of this, was that there's all this differentiation, just to kind of plant the seed. Oh, I love this. Hold on one. Sorry, I know I'm going fast, but I'm just trying to flip to the one here. So you can see when we start to get into specific scenarios, you can see that there's a lot of different options here just for early periods. In Chinese medicine, there's a lot of different causes, and this might be like a different language to you right now, but it will make sense if you're going through the course. And these charts really help you decode if someone has late periods, what are the common causes of that? And there's very different ways to work with these different things. So we have all the differential diagnosis from a TCM perspective here. Again, as yoga teachers, our job is not to diagnose, but this gives us a nice backdrop to understanding the person we're working with. So you can see we have that breakdown for all the different conditions. So then I want to show you the practice site, whether you're a student or a teacher. I just want to show you how to find some of this stuff in here. So if you're not me, okay, you go to me. This is mine, so I have it under my classes. But if you go to my page on the Yoga Medicine Online and then scroll down, you've got all my classes here you can filter through. So you can find all those, and you could search in here for menses or different classes. But I also have a curated playlist, this fertility and IVF support. Now, even if you're not trying to get pregnant, there's some good information in here. I mean, ultimately, when we're talking about fertility, we're talking about optimizing the cycle, optimizing it to do what it does best. So a lot of what we talk about for fertility is applicable to most, in a general sense, to regulating hormones in general. Though, as I mentioned in the course, we go through a lot of specifics and individualization, but there's a lot of detail here around kind of what we've just talked about and some things to keep in mind in the different phases here. And then I've got a menses practice, a post-menstrual practice, that's that follicular phase, more restorative and with some circulation in the pelvis, the sparking yang and ovulation, and then a lot of different options. This feel-good flow isn't necessarily a fertility one, but a great one for that luteal phase. And I mentioned it in the write-up here. And then the couple of meditations I really like that are great for nervous system regulation and calming. And then some other options here. Again, I explain a lot of this in this little side note, so I won't go into detail now, but that's a really great resource as well. And then of course you can always find, if you're searching all the classes, you could have me in there or not. When you're looking through them, we've got a lot of postnatal and prenatal too in here. When you're looking at these, as you're searching, maybe you're, let's say you want, let's go back, sorry. Let's say you want to flow. Let's say a hatha vinyasa. Maybe you're looking for some luteal phase practices, and maybe you want a specific length. When I'm looking at these two, once I find one that sounds good to me, I can also see just how vigorous it is. So we do 5 bars is the most strength we could imagine. So that would be more of our conditioning classes, the amount of movement, the amount of mobility work and calming. So you can kind of look at these to find a practice that might feel helpful for you. All right, I've given you a lot. A lot of information there. So we do talk about menopause and perimenopause in the training. So it's a longer discussion, but yes, you can apply this somewhat depending on where they're at within that spectrum. But you can apply it somewhat, but it definitely is a longer conversation that we talk to in the course there. I think I already mentioned this one about running or weightlifting. Really any exercise can move qi and blood, but I find walking and running and those sorts of things as a better way to move qi and blood versus heavy weightlifting. Like really heavy weightlifting can move qi and blood acutely, but there can be some stagnation as an effect, for instance, like within the recovery cycle. So pick and choose if that's the only thing you like. I would say it's better than nothing. But if I was trying to move qi and blood, free flowing movement, running, walking, hiking are usually a little bit better for that. Yeah, IUDs and Tcm are, again, it's a longer answer, and it makes a little bit more sense once you have a little more understanding of the full perspective of Tcm and the cycle, but they're thought to create more stagnation. And so it can impact the cycle a little bit from that perspective, but different people are more or less sensitive to that than others, I find. Yeah, I think that the mental health side of, what goes along with premenstrual issues is a really important one. And, I'm trying to think of how I give a succinct answer to this. I would still support that circulation and movement of qi and blood for PMDD. So it would be similar recommendations as PMS, though with the caveat, like you saw in the manual, there's a further breakdown for everything. So sometimes blood deficiency can be the underlying cause of stagnation. So think about a river moving and flowing. We have that good flow of the river, like the blood, the qi in the blood. If there's not enough fluid in that river, it becomes stagnant, right? And so the stagnation that we see there isn't because there's a dam in the river, it's because there's not enough fluid. So there can be other reasons for that, I guess is my point. One of them can be blood deficiency. And again, that's a longer topic, but similar recommendations in general for the generalized recommendations. Yeah. We do talk a little bit about I just combined them, cysts and fibroids. But I would start with just the general suggestions that I mentioned to begin with, to help regulate hormones. I mean, they're estrogen dependent. We know that. So that regulation of hormones would be important, but we do talk more in the course on that. Would you suggest doing an abdominal massage during a period if it's heavy? Yeah, Tina, that's a great question. And the idea from a Chinese medicine perspective is that even though it's heavy, we do still want to release the whole lining. However, again, there's some caveats. It kind of depends in a TCM perspective of the underlying issues going on. So I would say if it feels good to you, if it feels helpful for now, go for it. Know that for some people, some of these compression techniques and abdominal massage can create a little surge in that menstrual bleeding acutely, which can be good. That's kind of what we're trying to do. However, if someone's having really, really heavy periods, it's a little bit longer discussion that needs to be looked at a little bit more individually. But we still want to shed the whole lining. Very important. Which of the hormones you mentioned are responsible for postpartum hair loss? Yes, hair loss in Chinese medicine, that postpartum hair loss is blood deficiency. So unfortunately, in Chinese medicine, childbirth is the most depleting event of our entire lifetime, and which is worth it. Well worth the gift of life, of course. But we've created another human being, and so that phase, postpartum phase, is mostly marked by deficiency of pretty much everything, but especially blood and yin. And so nutrition is really important. Again, a longer story, but looking at iron-rich foods and more restorative practices is really key from a yoga perspective. Well, we do talk a little bit about hysterectomy in the course, mainly as the menopausal shifts that happen, and the hormonal shifts that happen as a result of that. And I think that, oh, there's some more on. We do talk about menopause. I'll plant this seed because I think it's so important and I want more and more people to hear it, but menopause is a freaking brilliant thing. It's brilliant. Our bodies spend so much time and energy going through a cycle every month. And menopause is our inner intuition, our body's wisdom of conserving energy. And I think most women can appreciate that appreciation of not having periods anymore. But it's where we actually, this idea is that our energy actually starts to flatten out's not the right word, but to kind of streamline more. And that there is kind of like this connection to a deeper wisdom and intuition that's really powerful that our modern society has lost connection to, because we have so many negative implications with menopause and getting older. And yet in cultures where age is appreciated, where there's a wisdom associated with it, which are very few now, that women show really none, if any, symptoms of menopause. It's very rare. So appreciating the wisdom of the period, of that cycle of our lives, I think is really important. But then we go through a differentiation of different protocols in TCM. If you're rarely having periods, it's a harder question. Or if you're continuously taking the pill, there's not a cycle to go with. And that's, again, a longer, I knew this was going to open up so many great conversations, but, it's a tough one. Most women I know who most females who take the pill continuously don't really want to have a cycle. So they're not usually coming in asking for that. Although there are other reasons for taking the pill continuously that, like if someone has endometriosis and they're taking it continuously, then what I'd want to focus on is moving Qi and blood, because endometriosis is really a stagnation condition. Again, these are kind of deeper discussions beyond the course of this seminar. We're running a little bit over here, but for those rarely having periods, I want to focus on the underlying cause, which again is a longer answer, but are they yin deficient? Are they blood deficient? Are they having Qi stagnation? Are they having painful periods, really painful periods? And that's why they're taking it continuously, in which case I would really want to support that movement of Qi and blood and find a way to get that continuously. I wouldn't need to fluctuate through all those 4 phases if they're not having a cycle, but I would really want to focus on the underlying condition, which is, again, beyond what we've talked about here. We do talk about menopause. So yes, we will talk about that, and premature menopause, regardless of when it happens. We'll talk about menopause. Ooh, last one. Okay, this one's an easy one. For painful ovulation in Chinese medicine, this is related to stagnation. And so I would do the same thing I'm talking about. I know you're mentioned that you're not trying to conceive. I would go through that same thing, though, as a way to help spark that turnover at ovulation. So the local circulatory practices, the compression or myofascial release, whatever you like, to help create some circulation around that time. So I'd maybe start a few days before you, if you know when it's coming, or if not, around that time, or when you start to feel it is fine. But we want to try and get it going beforehand if possible. All right. Yes, we talk about clots. We do. That's a symptom of stagnation. There's so many good questions. I'm so excited that you guys have such great questions, because really, I feel like in Western medicine, we don't have any answers for these things. And so it's really cool and really empowering, I think, to be able to create some of these shifts. Now, if you don't want to dig into all the details, maybe just having a balanced practice that hits a lot of these bases throughout the cycle. If you're not experiencing any reproductive symptoms or cycle symptoms, I think maybe just having that, you don't need to overthink this. I think there's the brilliance of the yoga practice. But now as we start to dig into it, we can find these little subtle shifts to help support through the cycle. When there's something like endometriosis where there's a lot of pain, I might be really focusing on moving Qi and blood the whole cycle. And maybe that's my focus. So again, I don't want to confuse you too much. There's a lot of room to individualize. I'm just trying to create some clarity around it not being just one simple little thing. But this is a great place to start. If you're looking to regulate hormones and your cycle with yoga. I love yoga just because it's accessible. Everyone can do it. We don't need fancy tools. Everyone's got a bath towel that they could use to roll up. Or when I'm traveling, sometimes I don't even have a yoga mat, and you can do it on the floor. You figure it out. And so sharing some of these tools with you that you can do regularly, the regularity is the important part, and to recognize these fluctuations in the cycle and to give yourself space to relax after your period, to take some restorative moments. Again, that doesn't mean you can't exercise, but, focusing on some of that, sensing this growth phase, and maybe just having an awareness of what's shifting and happening, I think can also guide that. So these can look very different for each person, how I support these phases. So finding a way that works for you, that feels relevant and accessible. And of course, listening to how your body responds is very important. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully it gives you some really nice tools to use. And if you're a student, again, you can just pop onto the practice.yogamedicine.com site and just use those classes there and the guidance there. That's pretty straightforward. And now you have a deeper understanding of why. And if you're a teacher, we always have more resources for you, so you can join us in the training if you like. All right. Thank you guys so much. Oh, I see someone from Bellevue. Oh, that's very close to me. I'm in Kirkland. Hi. Jen from Barbados. Hello. I know there's so many comments in here. Cramping during ovulation. Yes, same thing. That's the stagnation. Oh, a mother and daughter. Hi. Oh, I think you saw the live schedule for the course. Judith, sorry, I'm seeing a few questions in here. If you put them in the chat, I might have missed them. This course does not go over pregnancy. That's a whole nother can of worms there. So this one's really about the lead up to pregnancy. Talk a little about the shift, a little bit briefly of things to not do anymore once you're pregnant. But really, this is not about pregnancy or postnatal. That's another discussion. And we actually have a lot of prenatal and postnatal classes on Yoga Medicine Online too. All right. Yay. Yes, it's very comprehensive. One day we'll have a pregnancy and a postnatal course. I haven't been in too much of a hurry because I feel like there's a bunch of those out there, but I don't know of any other fertility and yoga and TCM ones. So I just love sharing this with you. I hope you enjoy it. If you have questions or comments, Instagram, you can comment on our post or send a chat or email us info@yogamedicine.com. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you somewhere, maybe in person soon. I'll drop a little note. Maybe we're looking at hopefully having an in-person training in August. Keep your eyes peeled. It won't be women's health, but keep your eyes peeled. And we're sending out a survey too to see what you guys want as we make those choices. So keep your eyes peeled. If you're in our 500-hour program, if you filled out an application or done a training, you'll get that email to cast your vote. But hopefully we're hoping to have one in August soon. So I love you all. I hope to see you soon online, in person, wherever that is. I hope you take care, and I will see you soon.